If you're eating the same thing on your zone 2 sessions as you are your intense zone 5 sessions, you are leaving so much untapped potential on the table. Yes, my people, my name is Sam Gerlin, founder of Gerlin Nutrition. I'm a fully qualified nutritionist and coach who is looking to help people, the everyday athlete, untap their true potential using nutrition and a holistic health approach to reach their health and fitness goals. Today, we are talking about how to fuel for the zone of training that you're working in. Okay, we're going to tap into what exactly the training zones are from zone 1 all the way up to zone 5. We're going to, of course, be talking about how best to fuel for those zones, what to do when you're training double days, and much more. So without any further ado, let's get straight into it. As always, I've got my laptop here to make sure, I'm not missing any points and providing as much value as possible. But as I say, we'll get straight into this, starting with what exactly the training zones are and what energy systems are utilized during those zones. So we'll start from the bottom and work our way up. Now, zone 1 is a very, very easy zone. You might, compare this to a fast walk or, a very, very light cycle. And the primary energy source in these zones is fat. Okay, that's very, very simple. You're fully aerobic, so you're using oxygen to fuel your performance. So you're tapping into your fat stores to fuel this sort of workout. Okay, so again, just to give an example, it's a recovery walk, it might be a mobility session or a very, very light spin on the bike. Okay, moving up into zone 2. Now, this is very much a buzzword in the fitness and health industry at the moment. Everyone's talking about zone 2, and it is for good reason. Now, this is, again, an easy aerobic pace. This could be a light jog, a light cycle, and it's really, really important zone 2 training for building a really strong aerobic base. A lot of people talk about, building most of your endurance work in this zone. So depending on how much volume you're putting in per week, you might be looking at anywhere between 60 to the elites are putting in 90% of their work in this low zone 2, low zone 3 aerobic zone. Okay, so in this zone, you're still using predominantly fats. You might be tapping into a little bit of carbs, but a good split to think about is 70% fats, 30% carbohydrates. We'll get into the weeds a little bit and get into the details in just a moment here. But zone 3 is more of a moderate intensity, and a lot of people call this the tempo zone. And this is where you're using a real mixed fuel. You start to sort of increase how many carbohydrates you're taking and come to sort of a 50-50 split. So 50% fat utilization, 50% carbohydrate utilization. You're really drawing from both substrates here. Okay, and some examples are, a steady state run or a steady state cycle. I'm using bike and run because they're just easy to sort of envision and picture here. Moving up into zone 4, again, this is another zone that a lot of people are talking about at the moment, especially in the high rock space, because a lot of people are talking about using zone 4 as a way to really build your ability to deal with lactate, which is so important during something like a high rocks or, the half marathon distance. So here in the threshold zone, zone 4, we're using predominantly carbs. This is where the sort of 50-50 starts to become 60-40, and then the higher we go in zone 4, 70-30, 80-20, okay? So these are our lactate threshold interval runs. So for me, just to use an example, if my steady state run is, at a 4:30 pace, my lactate threshold runs will be anywhere between sort of a 4-minute and a 4:15 pace. Okay, so that's where I'm in those zone 4 heart rate zones. For me, that's, anywhere between sort of 165 and 175 beats per minute. Final zone is zone 5, which is like a flat out effort. This is your VO2 max training. So VO2 max is the maximum amount of energy, or not energy, maximum amount of oxygen we can uptake. So here we're using 90% plus, 90% to 100% carbs. Okay, so these are short interval sessions. So perhaps you're doing, 5 by 400, 8 by 400, and then a few 200 meters around the track. For example, you might be doing some, high rocks intervals, burpees into another station or whatever it may be. You get the point. It's really, really high intensity. The key here to think about is as the intensity increases, so as we move from zone 1 to zone 2, 3, 4, 5, your body shifts from burning mostly fat at the beginning to carbohydrates as you move up. So that's the key point to take away from this section here. Okay, moving into section 2, now we're talking about or getting into more detail around the macronutrients that we're going to be using here. So in those lower intensity, it might be a slightly longer duration of session. So, you know, we tend to do our zone 2 for longer, if that makes sense. So you might be sat on the bike for 60 minutes to an hour. You might be out running for 65 minutes or 45 minutes to an hour. Okay, so here again, we're using predominantly fat and there's a lower reliance on carbohydrates. So pre-workout, what you might take on with this in mind is, for me personally, I like to just, if I know I've got an easy day where I've got a couple of zone 2 sessions or just one long zone 2 session for a couple of hours, I'm not thinking too much about taking on carbs. There will of course be some carbohydrates in the meal, but for me, if you know me, you follow my content for a while, I love kefir. So I'll have my kefir bowl in the morning before one of these sessions. I keep it pretty standard. So that's 40% kefir yogurt, 60% Greek yogurt, and then I throw in loads of berries and nuts and seeds and, you know, all sorts. Go and follow me over on Instagram if you're curious to know a little bit more. I post my kefir bowl every single day, topping it with different fruits, seeds, nuts, just for that nutritional variety, which is so good for gut health and reducing inflammation. But that's not the point of this video. You can tell I get excited about this sort of stuff. But anyway, during your workout, there's no real necessity to take on carbs or anything like that. If you're practicing a fueling strategy, you might try to see how your body reacts to stomaching carbs on these sessions, but I'd stay clear from it. You only really want to hydrate during these sessions because you are going to be sweating, so making sure you're taking on some water, some electrolytes, and you might have a slight or a small glucose or carbohydrate mix just to make sure that you're hydrating efficiently, because, you know, glucose can help with, you know, the uptake of electrolytes and hydration effectively. So there's no real need to take on anything during these sorts of sessions. Post-workout, again, it's important. If you didn't watch my last video, make sure you go and watch this, because we really go into a deep dive on, you know, how to split your macros around your training sessions. But after your session, you just want to take on a nice healthy balance of protein, carbs and fat. There's no real need to get too caught up in this. Very, very simple. If you're training later in the day, you might increase the amount of carbohydrates. That's up to you. Again, and I mentioned this in the last video as well, if you're, you know, practicing these sorts of things, you start to become intuitive with it and notice what makes you feel good, because everybody reacts differently. So some people feel great on a slightly higher fat diet, some people feel great on a slightly higher carbohydrate diet, and it's just about establishing that balance. And, you know, you can take that into your post-workout nutrition. This is also a great zone to train fasted, you know, if that is something that you're interested in. I don't tend to recommend it, especially if your volume and intensity is high, but if you are interested in, you know, fasted training, this is the zone to do it in. Zone 1, zone 2. This is where you can get away with, you know, no fuel at all, because you're just tapping into your fat stores. Okay, moving into zone 3, zone 4. So this is that tempo to threshold zone. This is where I love to train. This is where I get that buzz after the session. Zone 5 leaves you absolutely exhausted, but zone 3 and 4, you come away, you feel great about yourself, okay? So now we're tapping more into carbohydrates. The higher you go into zone 3, zone 4, and to the upper end of zone 4, we're really utilizing more carbohydrates, okay? So 60 to 90 minutes prior to a session, or let's just round that up to 2 hours. Within the 2 hours before your session, you're going to want to be taking on at least 50 grams of carbs. That's a nice round number to think of. You can get that from 2 bananas. You can get that from a few rice cakes, banana and a bit of honey. Those are some of my typical go-tos. You know, some people like oats, slightly more fibrous, so you might find some digestive issues there. If you do, aim to take that, you know, maybe 2 to 3 hours before if you're taking on oats. But those are some examples of carbohydrate-based meals that you can take on before these sorts of sessions. If you've got longer before your session, you can look at taking on 2 grams per, you know, kilogram of your body weight. So using me as an example, as a reference point, I'm 75 kilograms. So 4 hours before, or in the 4 hours leading into the session, I'm going to want to be taking on 150 grams of carbs total. So say I'm training at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I have my lunch at 12, I have a pasta-based dish or a rice-based dish, I'm taking on, you know, 100 grams of carbs there. then 1 to 2 hours before, I'll have my couple of bananas. So that's my 150 grams there, just as an example, so you're fully aware of what I'm talking about there. During your session, if your session is less than 60 minutes, there's no real need to take on any intra-workout fuel. You might experiment with taking on a gel, again, to emulate race day strategy. This is more important doing that here than it is in zone 1 and 2. But again, you're going to want to be taking on some water and some electrolytes. Having maybe a carb mix with your electrolytes, a lot of good products out there that combine electrolytes and carbs now for optimal hydration. I work a bit with, or have worked a bit with Liquid IV, and they do an excellent mix. So I'll leave their link in the description down below. But yeah, you only really need water and electrolytes. If your session is exceeding an hour, then I think it's definitely more necessary to start taking on some carbs. So you might look at around 20 to 40 grams per hour, for example, at this sort of zone 3 to zone 4 range. After your session, it becomes more important after a more intense session to take on carbs and protein. Fats, healthy fats, are going to slow down the digestive process, which reduces the absorption of the carbohydrates, or the rate of absorption of carbohydrates and protein. Carbohydrates and protein are going to be essential for your recovery. I think I mentioned this in the last video, and I will confirm it in this one, but if you don't take on carbs and protein, carbs especially within the hour after your training, you can reduce your recovery ability by up to 30%. So that just highlights how important it is to take on carbs and protein. So skip the healthy fats after. A great way to do this is perhaps with a protein shake, like a carb and protein shake. So for me, that might be a scoop of quality whey protein isolate with a banana, some berries and some honey. Nice and easy. I take that on straight away, and then when I get home or back from the gym, I'm having my more substantial whole food meal with perhaps that's eggs on toast with some smoked salmon, as an example. Okay, sourdough toast, for those wondering. I prefer sourdough because it's slightly easier on the gut. It's fermented, so it's a bit better for you, just to point that out. But a good ratio to think about when you're taking on your carbs and your protein is 3 carbs, or 3 carbs for every 1 protein. Nice and easy, okay? What else have we got here? I think that's pretty much it for zone 3 and zone 4. So we'll move on to zone 5, and this is where I don't tend to train in this zone 5 zone anymore. Very, very rarely, and maybe just for, 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session. I don't think it's wholly necessary for what I'm currently training for, but if you are looking to increase your VO2 max, this is the best place to train. It's a critical zone, and carbs are so important here. If you're not taking on carbs, you're going to burn out, you're not going to finish the session, it's not going to be pretty, you're going to be exhausted at the end, you're not going to be able to recover. So it becomes so important to get carbohydrates on around these sorts of sessions. So you're going to want 2 to 4 hours out a really high carb meal. It does depend on the volume, the duration, because zone 5 is intense no matter what. If you're doing intervals for 30 minutes to 60 minutes, you're going to want to take on a lot of carbs. So 2 to 4 hours out, you're going to want to take on 2 to 4 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. So for me, again, 75 kilogram-ish athlete, I want anywhere between 150 grams all the way up to potentially 300 grams of carbs for these sorts of sessions. That's how important it is in the 4 hours leading into it. You can use the same sort of stacks as I mentioned for the zone 3 and zone 4, but just increasing the volume. So you might have 2 bananas and the rice cakes with a little bit more honey, and then 30 minutes before you might have a carb gel, to make up the numbers. And that's on top of perhaps a meal 4 hours out. If you're waking up first thing in the morning and doing a critical VO2 max session an hour after waking with very minimal carbs in the system, it's going to be difficult. You can do it with 50, 60 grams of carbs, but with those carbs not having a lot of time to sort of digest, it can be difficult. You want a backlog of carbohydrates basically. So perhaps save these sorts of sessions for ever so slightly later in the day, not too close to bedtime, because you won't be sleeping if you're peaking your heart rate to this sort of intensity, or not sleeping very well anyway. During the session, again, this depends on duration. So a good, sort of reference point to think about is if you've ever raced, whatever it is that you've raced, a half marathon, high rocks marathon, you're going to be, sort of peaking into zone 5 because it's an all-out effort. It's got to be sustainable, obviously. You might start in sort of zone 3, zone 4, but towards the end start creeping into zone 5 as things become tougher. And if you don't stay on top of your nutrition and your carbohydrate intake and your electrolyte intake during a race, you're going to blow up. You're going to hit the wall. So it's the same for training. So you're going to want to take in on some intra-workout fuel. So that might be carbohydrate gels, chews. What other examples could we use? Some people like whole foods, so some people do just smash bananas. It's not for me personally, slightly too much fiber there, but some people like the fructose, some people like honey and things like this. But you're going to be wanting a nice balance of glucose and fructose for these sorts of sessions. So again, gels for me are ideal. Sports drinks are another one. Just to go back on that point, fructose aren't wholly necessary. That can become important the more carbohydrates you take on. So the longer the duration of the intensity, what happens is we get some gut disruption if we're taking on too many glucose and not any fructose, because they use different pathways. So the fructose can help us take on more carbohydrates effectively. So I hope that makes sense. Not really necessary for you to know, but I thought I'd throw that in there just so there's no confusion around the glucose fructose thing. Fructose is sugar from fruits. Glucose is the sugar that's broken down in things like gels from things like maltodextrin, which is another sort of carbohydrate. But we're getting into unnecessary details here, so that's just there for you to know if you want to know it. If not, ignore that. No worries at all. You don't need to know it. Anyway, post-workout, again, immediately after, carbohydrates, protein, a shake is great for that. Get on your whole foods, as soon as you can, but get some nutrition on straight away. Okay, pretty simple. It becomes more important. Again, I said I'd touch on this. If you're training double days, I'll skip to this section. I was going to save this for last, but as we're on it now, if you're training double days, the need and the importance of fueling straight after your workout and keeping on top of your nutrition earlier in the day, being proactive with it, becomes so much more important. Because, as I mentioned, if you're not taking on your carbohydrates within an hour, you can impact your recovery by up to 30%. That leaves you with so much, on the table for your second session of the day, especially if you've got 2 intense sessions that day. If it's a big day of training, you're not going to be able to show up with the quality required in your second session if you're not proactive earlier in the day. So please, please, please take on your carbohydrates and your protein as soon as you can after these sorts of sessions, especially on your double days. What else did I want to touch on here today? So a little touch on, electrolytes and hydration strategy. Regardless of what session you're doing, whether it's zone 1 all the way up to zone 5, you're going to be getting a little bit of a sweat on. So, the more intense you're training, the more you're sweating, the more sodium you're losing, the more potassium, magnesium you're losing, the more important it is to take on salts, of course. So an electrolyte drink mix really does help with that. I think it's important to consider that you need to be, again, proactive with this. Don't drink to thirst, drink to, sweat loss and your training needs, because we don't always feel thirsty, but we almost always need to drink during these sorts of sessions. Okay, so that's just a point to touch on. You want to be proactive with it and not reactive, because as soon as you start to cramp and you've not got the sodium for your muscles to contract and the potassium and the magnesium, which are the 3 main sort of electrolytes that are going to be driving your performance. Calcium has a part to play, of course, as well, but those 3 there are super important. If you're not proactive with it and you start to cramp, it's really hard to recover from that. But if you're on top of it and make sure you've got a constant supply, it can be really, really helpful. So on race day and during those intense sessions, if you haven't got the opportunity to drink per se, you might have just salt tablets. They can be helpful. You can put them in the pocket. They're nice and small. They can be really helpful. So that's just another point I wanted to mention. But outside that is what I wanted to touch on today. Hopefully I provided plenty of value there. I'm conscious of the time as we approach the 20-minute mark here. So I'll wrap things up there. If you want to learn a little bit more about these sorts of things, you want a little bit of help actually incorporating this into your training, you want to, find out a little bit more, there is actually a funnel. For full transparency, it's a funnel in the description down below. So you can go and check that out. Go and click on the link. Obviously, no pressure at all to do so. I'm just making you fully aware. If you want to learn a little bit more, the option is there for you, and I'd be more than happy to help. Okay, but that is the end of this video. If you've got any questions, please do let me know. Drop me a DM over on Instagram or write it in the comment section down below. And having said that, please do like, comment and subscribe. It really does help me out. It shows me that you're interested in these sorts of videos. You know, helps me decide on what content I'm going to be making next, so I'm providing as much value as possible. As I say that, I'm making 2 to 3 YouTube videos a week, so I'm coming with plenty of value. So that's another reason to subscribe, because the content is coming thick and fast. The value is coming thick and fast. If there's anything that you want to see from me, again, chuck it in the comment section down below. Really does help me out. But other than that, that is the end of this video. I thank you all so much for watching. If you got to this point, you're an absolute legend. I really do appreciate you. So have yourself a blessed day, and I will see you all in the next one in a bit.